All right, let's talk about Rudolf Steiner. Now, you've probably come across his name, right? Maybe from Waldorf schools, or you've seen the word biodynamic on a fancy bottle of wine. But the man behind all of this, well, he's one of the most polarizing figures of the entire 20th century.
I mean, how can one guy be the inspiration for a global education movement that's all about creativity, but at the really same time be written off by his critics as a demented messiah? How did he pioneer one of the first ever forms of organic farming, only to have it slapped with the label of pseudoscience? This is what we're calling the Steiner paradox. He's this figure who just completely defies any easy box you try to put him in. He lives right at that messy intersection of genius and, well, deep, deep controversy. To figure this out, we've got to go back to the beginning. So to even begin to get a handle on these contradictions, we have to look at where he came from. Because before Rudolf Steiner was any kind of spiritual guru, he was a man who was firmly, and I mean really firmly, rooted in science and philosophy. So you look at his early life, right, and it reads like a classic academic success story. He's at a top-tier technical university studying the hard sciences, math, physics, chemistry. Then, while he's still a student with basically no credentials, he gets this unbelievable opportunity to edit the scientific works of the great Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. I mean, that's huge. He follows that up with a PhD and publishes a major philosophical work. This is a guy building a very serious intellectual foundation in Western thought. But, and this is the big twist, running right alongside this super rigorous academic life was a totally private, spiritual one. Steiner said he'd had clairvoyant experiences since he was a little kid. And what's so fascinating is how he tried to bring these two worlds together. He wasn't just happy having mystical feelings. No, he wanted to prove them with the same certainty as a geometric theorem. This quote just nails his lifelong mission, to somehow fuse the seen and the unseen, science and spirit. So this quest of his eventually leads him to the Theosophical Society. This was a hugely popular spiritual movement at the turn of the century, kind of blending Eastern mysticism with Western occult ideas. You'd think it would be a perfect fit, but Steiner was fiercely independent. His time there was going to be pretty short, and it all ended in a massive split.
And the breaking point was a classic spiritual power struggle. The leaders of the Theosophical Society basically declared this young Indian boy, Jiddu Krishnamurti, was the new world teacher, a reincarnation of Christ. Steiner just flat out rejected it. He wanted a spiritual path that was, in his view, uniquely European, one that was rooted in figures like Goethe and in Western traditions like Rosicrucianism. So he walked, and he took the entire German branch of the society with him. He called his new path Anthroposophy, which literally means human wisdom. And the core idea here was pretty radical. He was arguing that the spiritual world wasn't just a matter of faith. No, he said it was a reality that you could objectively research and get to know through intense, disciplined inner training. He was, for all intents and purposes, trying to create a science of the spirit. And he didn't just write about this worldview, he literally built it. The Goetheanum in Switzerland became the physical heart of his entire movement. It was this amazing cultural center for art, for drama, and for his School of Spiritual Science. And the building itself, which Steiner designed, is considered a masterpiece of modern architecture. So, another check in the innovator column. Okay, so this is where it gets really important. How did all these esoteric spiritual ideas actually translate into the real world? This is where Steiner's most famous and definitely most controversial projects were born. This is where the theory really hits the pavement. First up, and this is probably the one you've heard of, Waldorf education. It actually started in 1919 in a school for the children of workers at the Waldorf Astoria cigarette factory. And its whole philosophy of educating the head, heart, and hands was truly revolutionary for its time. It focused on creativity and emotional growth just as much as intellect. And today, it's a massive global network with over 1,000 schools. And yet, right from the get-go, the academic world was, let's just say, deeply skeptical. They dismissed him with these really condescending terms like autodidact and gypsy intellectual. They basically saw him as an outsider, not a real educator, someone whose spiritual ideas had absolutely no place in a school. And this kind of dismissal would just become a recurring theme in his life.
So next, you have biodynamic agriculture. In the 1920s, a group of farmers who were getting worried about all the new chemical fertilizers came to Steiner looking for an alternative. He gave them a whole system that treats the farm as a single living organism. It was one of the very first forms of modern organic farming, really emphasizing soil health and sustainability. But here we go again. The scientific community pushed back, and they pushed back hard. I mean, when farmers started burying cow horns stuffed with manure to supposedly align with cosmic forces, agricultural scientists threw up their hands and called it pseudoscience. Sure, the core organic ideas were great, but the more mystical stuff, they said it was closer to alchemy or magic. And this just perfectly illustrates that recurring pattern in Steiner's legacy. And you guessed it, the exact same pattern holds for anthroposophical medicine. Steiner worked with doctors to create this holistic approach to health, and it grew into a huge global industry of naturopathic products. The company Weleda is probably the most famous example. But because its foundations are in what critics call occult ideas, it is almost universally rejected by the mainstream medical community. And the criticism here gets even more blunt. People use words as stark as quack. You see the pattern? A practical innovation, immediately followed by charges of pseudoscience. That's the Steiner story in a nutshell.
But as sharp as those critiques of pseudoscience are, they almost pale in comparison to an even more complex and frankly deeply troubling part of Steiner's legacy. This goes way beyond his methods and right into his morality. So according to the sources, if you dig into Steiner's collected works, they are just filled with these pervasive internal contradictions about race. On the one hand, he would preach about the spiritual unity of all people and slam racial prejudice. But on the other hand, he was promoting these ideas of complex racial hierarchies. And he made some deeply anti-Semitic statements, like calling the continued existence of Judaism an error of history. This wasn't just some minor footnote. It was a really problematic thread woven deep into his spiritual worldview. The sheer strangeness of some of his clairvoyant claims led people, even back then, to question his sanity. We're talking prominent psychiatrists, including the famous Carl Jung, who actually diagnosed him with schizophrenia, pointing to what they called delusions of grandeur. But this diagnosis was, and still is, hotly debated. Other experts pointed out that, yeah, his beliefs were bizarre, but the man was incredibly high-functioning. He was a prolific writer, a lecturer, an organizer. It just didn't fit the clinical picture of someone who was impaired. So in the end, where does that leave us with Rudolf Steiner? He remains this man of just profound contradictions. He inspired artists and architects and educators, and he created these movements that are still thriving today. And yet, his work is completely shadowed by pseudoscience and these truly unsettling racial theories. So what was he? Innovator, guru, charlatan? The truth is it's probably some messy combination of all three. And that leaves us with a really difficult and I think a very modern question. How do we separate the creator from their creation? How do you separate a founder from their foundations?